Season 1 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley, Daniel Murphy, and Douglas Dollars, who reminds you to be present, be loving, and that life moves really fast. So it's late at night, we're in a 24-hour coffee shop. What does this setting have for you as far as mental associations with discussions about film?
Pretty much everything. For the last, I'm going to say 10 to 12 years, I've been a night person. And pretty much everywhere you go, and I've lived in several cities, you'll find all-night coffee shops. And I've always liked the idea of just going out with friends. And I've never been much of a drinker, which is to say I've never been any kind of drinker. And so I would just go out and just talk and have what I hoped were, meaningful conversations. And film was pretty much it. And even now, I'd say about once a week, it's not at all unusual for me to go out with a friend of mine named Jason and just talk about the movies we've seen recently, but then also talk about, what's going on in our lives and that sort of thing, but just catching up about movies, and that's pretty much what I've been doing with one person or another for the last 12 years.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting here with a guest who is back from the old show, back from the Marketplace of Ideas, the show that let this show burst forth like a butterfly from a cocoon. Tyler is, of course, a film critic and the co-host of Battleship Pretension. Last time he was on, they talked about the podcast. He and his co-host, David Bax, whom you're going to hear on this show fairly soon, I think. Haven't quite recorded with him yet, but we're at a Denny's. We're in North Hollywood, California. Living the life. Tell me about North Hollywood. It's for people who don't come from Los Angeles, it's not the north of Hollywood. It's not technically Los Angeles. What is this place?
North Hollywood is a place that has no reason to be called that. Not only is it not north, the north part of Hollywood, it's not connected to Hollywood at all. And when I say that, I mean it's not geographically connected, nor is it philosophically connected. Like, it's not like, oh, well, there's this, North Hollywood has its own little film industry, and it's north of Hollywood, so we decided to call it North Hollywood. It's nothing like that. It's just, as far as I can tell, I've lived here for about 5 years now, and as far as I can tell, it's just regular people, many of whom don't even work in the industry and have no desire to. Just families living here. It's not necessarily the highest, the most upscale place, but I've actually, I like it a great deal. It's precisely because it's a little bit removed from the industry and some of the, I'm sorry to sound all Holden Caulfield-esque, but the phoniness of Hollywood. It's just regular people. When I go to Ralph's, I don't have to worry about being judged for the things that I buy, as opposed to if I'm down at a Trader Joe's in Hollywood. And so yeah, that's. But what's interesting is that over the last few years, North Hollywood has tried to become a little bit more artistically minded. There's a part called the NoHo Arts District, and for a long time, many people, including myself, were thinking like, well, why is it called that? Like, there's one live theater, but as time has gone on, like, nicer restaurants have opened in that area, more theaters. Just recently, a Laemmle theater has opened, like in the last few weeks, in that area of North Hollywood. And so slowly but surely, I think the city is starting to change. It'd be interesting to see what it'll look like in 2 years. And it might not be as... I don't know, it might be a little hipper than the place that I moved to, and I might have to move somewhere less hip.
Now, when you were on the show with David Bax, your Battleship Pretension co-host, co-creator, last time we mentioned a little bit about your time together at Columbia College Chicago at film school. Tell me about the run-up to coming out to Los Angeles. I would imagine there's a certain going out to Hollywood baggage. Whether you're moving to North Hollywood or to Hollywood or to any other part of the city, there's got to be a. How are you conceiving of it? Was it just natural, or did you come out here thinking, well, I'm not doing it in the way all those other people are doing it?
Oh, no, I knew I was doing it in that way. So in regards to David moved out here about a year and a half before I did. My wife and I got married in June of 2005. My wife and I had both graduated from Columbia College and desperately wanted to stay in Chicago. Chicago is a really wonderful city. I really loved it there, as did she. And I was looking for any kind of production work. At the time, I still fancied myself a screenwriter. And I was looking for any kind of work, and I really didn't. There wasn't anything. Like, I came to realize that Chicago isn't a terrible place for film, but film starts elsewhere and then will go to Chicago. It doesn't originate there. And so it became pretty clear. I'm under the impression that pretty much nobody wants to move to Los Angeles. They want to stay where they are, but then only when they realize that the only way they're going to be successful at all in film or television, they have to move to Los Angeles or New York, but especially Los Angeles. And so we took a trip in late June of 2006 to talk to a couple of people we knew out here, including David and his then girlfriend, and then a couple other people who were friends of friends, just to see if, kind of take the temperature of the area and see if there's anything that I could possibly do. And a friend of mine who worked on the Warner Brothers lot, he got me, he showed me around, and then he got me a meeting with his boss about becoming a production assistant there. And the interview, I guess it was an interview, and it went pretty well. And she said, "Here's the thing, I would need you to start pretty much right now." And I said, "Well, right now I live in Chicago, and my wife, who's a wedding photographer, is in the middle of the summer. She wouldn't be able to join me for months and months, and I would be out here alone, and I'm still something of a newlywed." And I told her that, like, I don't think I can do it. I made a joke at the time, like, I have no intention of ruining my marriage until at least 3 years in. And she laughed and now it's fun, and she said she understood that, she respected it. But the very fact that I had that meeting and then talked with a couple other people that were very encouraging, that helped a lot. That sort of was the kick in the pants that we needed. And so we started planning to move out here, and then January of 2007 is when we finally moved out here. And by that time, it was an exciting thing. It was no longer I guess we have to do this. It was something we were both looking forward to a lot. And for the first year, it actually wound up being very difficult. We didn't know a lot of people. Not a lot of job opportunities were coming up. And it wound up being very difficult, so that excitement sort of dissipated. But since we've been here, a lot of really wonderful things have happened for both me and my wife. And so now I love Los Angeles, and I love the opportunities that I have here and nowhere else. Especially when it comes to podcasts and the people that I've gotten to meet through that.
Now, it's literally true to call this the city where you decided to be a film critic, but to what extent did the city turn you that way? Or did the environment you found yourself in make you into a film critic, or focused your energies on film criticism as opposed to production, or anything else people do in the sort of worlds and satellite worlds surrounding the industry here?
One thing, and I'm sure I've told this story before, the idea to do a film criticism podcast at all came about when I was still in Chicago, but I did not feel like I could do it because I needed a co-host, and the only person I would want to host it with at the time lived in Los Angeles. And so when I moved out here, David and I talked about hosting a show, and so at the very least, I wouldn't have a show if I hadn't moved to Los Angeles, just for that basic reason. But then as far as switching from screenwriting to film criticism, some of that had to do with just being, I worked, I had a couple of internship jobs, and then I had just a PA job at a post-production house. I did some script consulting, and what became clear is that two things became clear at once. One is that I do not have at all the stomach to work in this industry. You need to be someone who has kind of nerves of steel and somebody whose feelings are not hurt easily, because there are a lot of, I would say, monsters in this industry. I don't think there needs to be, but I think people have chosen to be that way, if for no other reason than because they feel like they need to perpetuate this image that maybe keeps out unwanted people. But and that's not my temperament at all. I'm very sensitive. One could say oversensitive. So that was one thing. Another thing was that as a writer, I realized I'm a pretty good writer when it comes to characters and especially dialogue. I was very good with dialogue, but with story I wasn't very good. And I came to realize like the scripts that I would write would never. I guess in theory they would sell, but it never seemed like it could be a career for me. And it just, everything became kind of drudgery. The one thing that wasn't was doing the podcast every week, because by the time I realized that, it was summer 2008, and the podcast had sort of taken off. I'd gotten to meet a lot of my podcasting heroes and various stand-up comedians and actors whose work I'd really enjoyed, and I found that rewarding. But what's more is getting to talk with people from all over the country who would listen to the show, and they would write in not even just compliments, but they would say like, "Oh, I disagree. I think this or that." And the idea of having a film conversation with people from all over the world became so exciting. And then also I was friends with, and still am friends with, a lot of aspiring actors and aspiring filmmakers, and some of them have had some success and some have not. And I would talk movies with them, and not all of them, of course, but some of them, this is going to sound a little egotistical, but it surprised me how many of them actually didn't know and didn't really seem to care much about film in general. And that surprised me, because I think that if you're a director, and even if you're an actor, I think it was mostly actors that had this opinion, these days you seem to feel as though you can't learn anything from the old days, especially from an acting standpoint, because the days of Humphrey Bogart and Edward G. Robinson and Katharine Hepburn, everything was a little bit heightened. And so what on earth could we learn from that? But you can learn from the small things that, like, Humphrey Bogart could do underneath that kind of, I mean, it wasn't a heightened exterior or anything, that's just how he was. But, you could just look at his eyes and see what he was feeling and what he was thinking. And that's something that actors could learn and directors could learn, and when it came to silent film especially. And so I would recommend movies to these friends of mine and all of that, and admittedly I probably forced them on them. I would often lend them movies whether they wanted me to or not, but they would watch it and they say that was really great. I had no idea. And so I guess it was something of an ego boost, but more specifically it was working to engender a love of film and a respect for film, past and present, the same one that I had. And so all of these things just sort of came about at the same time, and I realized, I guess the idea of quitting screenwriting is one way of looking at it, but frankly, I didn't think it was ever going to happen for me, and I wasn't really taking any pleasure in it. Whereas film criticism I found tremendously satisfying. But I was actually reluctant to call myself a film critic at the time, or say that that's what I wanted to do, because there is such a stigma of film criticism, which is, the person who wanted to be an artist of some kind and failed, so now they will take their revenge on the industry that rejected them. And so I held off for a long time, and I realized that it was really mostly reasons of personal pride that I was rejecting that. And then finally I said, you know what, I'm going to be a critic. That's what I want to be. That's what I like to do. And once I once I acknowledged that, my attitude changed almost overnight, and I realized how exciting it is to just be able to talk movies with people and learn from them, and I won't be so presumptuous as to say teach them, but just to try to have an open mind. And you realize the stigma of like the bitter critic, that's only true if you let it be. And so I sort of made it my goal over the last few years to make sure that that wasn't me, that I wouldn't be angry about the film industry and I wouldn't be bitter that it didn't happen for me, but that I would try to have a positive attitude and talk about just how wonderful film can be. That's a long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
Now, you mentioned the phenomenon of young film enthusiasts dragging their asses out to Los Angeles from wherever because that's where success is. That's where I go to be in the movies. That's where I work in the industry. I got to go to LA. Maybe I don't want to, but hey, I got to do it. Now, you drag your own ass out here, and you find that you have it in you to do film criticism. Was there a moment where you were like, oh, damn, I could have been in Chicago doing this, the land of Roger Ebert. Critics, come out of here. I think Jonathan Rosenbaum, who was on the predecessor to this show a few months ago, he came out of Chicago. Was there any like, oh, geez, maybe I should have stayed there to be a critic? Is there like a critical environment there that's strong, or a film history environment that's more suitable to this? Or I mean, you've made the pathway for yourself in Los Angeles, but is there that feeling that criticism in Chicago, that could have been a strong way to go too?
I've had that thought, but it actually went away pretty quick for a number of reasons. One is that I look at it very much as a domino effect. The only reason that I enjoyed the idea, that I liked the idea of doing criticism, was because I was doing the podcast. I would not have done the podcast if I had not moved out here. And so just from a cause and effect point of view, I wouldn't have known how fun and rewarding criticism could be unless I had moved out here. It had to happen that way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as I mentioned, I know a lot of actors and I know a lot of filmmakers, and there is something about being a critic in the midst of this, in the midst of the industry, where, you know, a friend of mine told me something when I still lived in Chicago, but he lived out here, and he said, when you are blind, not you as in me specifically, but when people in general are just blindly critical of an actor's performance or something like that, when you live in Los Angeles, you come to realize that's somebody that I could conceivably meet. Right. And what's more is you also realize that they are people. Now, as I said, some people are kind of monstrous, but most people out here have a genuine love of their craft, and they're out here trying to make a living at that craft. And I feel like a lot of critics remove themselves, they don't remove themselves, but they are removed from that, and so they are maybe a little too brutal. I'm not saying to soft pedal it. If a movie's bad, it's bad. If a performance is bad, it's bad. But the minute you realize that these are real people with real feelings, it doesn't mean you don't tell them the truth, but it does mean that rather than say, you made a bad movie, shame on you, it's more like, you could do so much better, and I know you can, and I think you probably know you can too. So next time, do better. And it can make a difference, and I feel like I wouldn't have that attitude if I lived somewhere else. Like being in the midst of it and knowing actors and comedians who have been on things and are frequently criticized in some way, shape, or form, has made me, I think, a bit more sensitive. But again, that's where another challenge comes in, which is to still try to be honest. I interned at a place that put out a little independent film, and I went to a screening of it, a cast and crew screening of it, and it was pretty bad. And so I reviewed it negatively, but I tried to think fairly because I knew the woman who wrote and directed it. And if I just said, this is absolutely terrible, it's good, she should be ashamed of herself or anything like that, reading something like that can be very frustrating and very discouraging. And I didn't and so because it's people, because you're dealing with people and not just these ideas, I think you look for what is good and you acknowledge what's bad, but you try to emphasize what's good.
And there's an extent to which you can even you're so deep in it that you can even avoid saying good or bad really straight out loud. At least it seems to me that way. A critic can actually write as much as they want about a movie and avoid saying words so vulgar as good and bad. You know what it is? Do you agree at all with that?
I think so, and it's interesting. I'm working on a writing project now and have for a long time. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not the most disciplined writer, and working on that project, which allows me, and I won't say what it is, but it has allowed me to explore the type of writer that I am, and I don't have to think in terms of a short review, and that has changed the way that I approach writing reviews. And I have some friends who've made just these little movies, and they're like, hey, a review would really help me out. And I said, like, okay, I'm going to write it how I want to write it. And they said, that's perfectly fine. So I write super long reviews without, I have a friend who made a film that incorporated home video footage of he and his sister when they were young. Because the lead of the film is him, and then the co-lead is played by his sister. And that's, I think he uses that very well. I wouldn't go so far as to say it was a gimmick, but he read the review and said, you don't even mention that. And I was like, I didn't think I had to. I was much more interested in discussing the themes of the film, and I said that it illustrated those themes well. Whether I go into details or not, that's up to me. And so, yeah, I actually don't think that you need to think purely in terms of good and bad. You could look if you had to, you could look at things in terms of realized and unrealized potential. And one could say that that's just a flowery way of saying good and bad, but unrealized potential still acknowledges that there is good there that just didn't happen, but it can be there, and it can be there next time. And I think it's a much more civil way of approaching things.
Now, we've touched on this a bit, and we talked quite a bit about it, in a way, the last time on the show with you and David at the same time, but Battleship Pretension as an extension of the conversations film geeks, shall we say, have in booths just like this all over America. I mean, how do you see the enterprise of film criticism in relation to all of those conversations going on? Is it that conversation held by other means, or do critics provide thought leadership for these conversations to look to? I mean, what's the relationship here?
I think that it can provide a jumping off point. I by no means think that a film critic's word is the last word. And actually, the more I've done, podcasted with BP or my other podcast, More Than One Lesson, the more I do that, the less, it's not that I have less faith in my opinion, but the less inclined I am to say, all right, it's written in stone now. But I do think that anybody who's had any kind of training knows more than you, and there's all kinds of people who know more about film than I do. I would actually venture to say that you are one of them, Colin. And
I should start a podcast.
You should start a podcast and do one about books. Do one about, I don't know, interesting people you meet.
I think so.
Or in some cases, people you meet that aren't that interesting. And then one about movies, one about just everything. Just make your own podcasting network. Like the Adam Carolla podcast.
Set myself up with a catheter. I'll have a closet full of gear, fully linked up. I can see it.
I think it could work,
especially the catheter,
like a Truman Show type podcasting system. Mm-hmm. So there's plenty of people who know more than I do, and I don't necessarily mean if they have an opinion about a film, I don't necessarily take that as gospel, but I will give them a little bit more credit because, they've seen plenty of things that I haven't seen, and they know more than I know, so I cannot agree, but that doesn't mean that I can't learn something. And so I think this might be my hope, but especially online when it comes to, as you say, film nerds talking about movies, my hope is that, the film critics, whether they be print or, television, not that there are very many of those left, or podcasting critics. My hope is that, as far as the conversation goes, people look at that and they don't outright reject it, nor do they just outright accept it, but they say, okay, that there's an opinion, it's been officially put out there, now what do I think? And it might coincide with that, it might not, and it might coincide in certain places and disagree other places. And so I think the critics definitely have a role to play in the larger conversation, but I don't think they have the ultimate last word.
Now, what makes a fascinating film discussion, and I mean this because I come at it from a perspective of whether talking with film geeks or talking with just, quote unquote regular folks in vinyl booths at Denny's or elsewhere, a lot of film discussions are just, I think this film is great, I think it sucks, well, I think it's great, I think it sucks, and okay, I guess we'll move on to talking about the weather. What brings a film discussion to a level that makes it interesting, not just a volley of statements of opinion, I guess?
I think trying to keep an open mind, and I guess the phrase, if it's never said, but just the general attitude of, oh, I never thought of that. To me, if you can say that, or if somebody can say that about something you've said, then I think the conversation is off and running. Because I do think if you keep an open mind about, I guess, anything, but when it comes to film, I mean, really it does come down to opinions and interpretations, and someone can have an interpretation that's completely unlike yours, and it doesn't mean they're wrong. Some interpretations might be closer to what the filmmaker intended, but I'm of the opinion that after a certain point, it doesn't matter what the filmmaker intended. And so if you're taking that opinion, then really any interpretation can be right and not right, and as long as we all have that attitude of, wow, I hadn't thought about that before, that's very interesting. Even if you don't agree with that, it's like, wow, an entire other point of view came to this conclusion. We saw the same movie, and this other person comes to the exact opposite conclusion that I came to, and that in itself, of course, depending on how the conversation goes, people can get a little defensive, but at the same time, it can also be invigorating. The idea that one thing can create two polar opposite opinions, doesn't that make that thing awesome? And don't you want to just talk about it more? And I've said this on Battleship Pretension a couple of times recently, but we will frequently have, David and I will frequently have conversations that just swirl around a topic, and we just keep saying things. We deviate from our notes constantly, and we just have a conversation about this topic in which he says something that intrigues me, and then I say something that builds on what he says, and then that intrigues him, and then he builds, and before you know it, I feel like we've grown closer to film, and I would say closer to each other, because you have a better view of who that person is and the way they approach the world. And I mean, I guess you could. I mean, there are some movies that I guess you could just say, that movie blows. But if a movie is truly good, I think you can never talk enough about it. And I think the key is to first keep an open mind to people whose opinions aren't yours.
Now, I would ask you about the importance, or if you put importance on extending the conversation beyond the kingdom of film geeks, but I think you do, because Battleship Pretension is tapped into the world of Southern California comedians. Because you're based in Los Angeles, that's a rich resource. I mean, you get comedians on there who they all but say, sorry guys, I don't see that many movies, but you still get movie-related thoughts out of them. And I mean, what has been interesting for you in digging opinions, digging memories about cinema out of people who are not by any means strong film enthusiasts or film geeks, say?
Well, I think, first off, David and I are just big comedy geeks. I've liked stand-up comedy ever since I was, I'm going to say, probably 8 or 9. There weren't a lot of places, that you could go for that, and I don't mean comedy clubs. I don't think I should have been going to comedy clubs at that age. But there was, Comedy Central, which when I was a kid was called the Ha Network. And then, and so they would air these various stand-up specials, and it was really wonderful. And I remember first seeing comedians like, Mark Maron and Jon Stewart and... let's see, who else? Nick DiPaolo and various others on a showcase called Comics Come Home, and that was amazing. And I remember seeing Kevin Pollak's HBO special, in which he of course did various voices, and it was really great. So I've been a fan of stand-up for a long time, as has David, and so the idea of having access to some of these people, many of whom I've been fans of for years and years, and the idea of having them on the show was exciting. But what quickly became clear is that a comedian is supposed to be somebody who looks at society with a critical eye. And it doesn't have to be like discussing politics in a hardcore way or religion or anything. It could be really... I apologize, I don't mean for this term to be insulting, sort of a shallow look at just the little aspects of pop culture, just the little things that we do. Either way, the whole nature of what their job is to look at the world a little closer and a bit more analytically, but to translate that into something that we can all relate to, not just them. And so I feel like with film, we all see film, but they are trained to be a little bit more critical and a little bit more analytical. And so I found talking to comedians about film is very, very exciting, because they can have interpretations that you would it's possible you've never heard before. And frankly, because we are willing to go as deep as the comedian is willing to go, we've gotten a lot of this. I apologize. This sounds like I'm bragging, and it's because I am. A lot of the comedians who come on the show say that was great. This was so much fun talking about movies, and even if the show is not that much, isn't really laugh out loud funny, I think they are excited. Just like I said earlier, they're excited to be using the same thing that they use to make their comedy. They're taking that and putting it towards something else. And so I think that has been a very rewarding aspect of bringing comedians on. It's not merely that they are often very funny and it makes the show more listenable, but they do have just a different point of view on life, and it's one that is not often mixed with something that is already meant to be analytical. And so that's it. Early on, it was really it was really just kind of the only quote-unquote celebrities we could get, but now we're really locked into it because it has worked out very well for us.
And in a way, some of those comedians are representatives of the film viewing culture, the film going culture around here, around Los Angeles, Southern California, but you've lived other places. We mentioned Chicago, there's Missouri, and there's Colorado in your background. Do you have a sense of, in the places you've lived, the places you've been, if not the filmmaking, not the film criticism, but just the basic film viewing is different from place to place? Or are we is this all just the American film-going culture at work?
Everywhere I've gone, I've found people who love movies and love really discussing them in an in-depth way, depending on where I go and at what stage I am in my life. There are more people or less that are willing to talk about movies in a meaningful way. But yeah, I mean, I have old friends back in Denver who, when I go back and visit, we'll talk movies, and they'll say, like, it's so fun to talk movies like this. I rarely get that opportunity. And so, and same with Missouri. I mean, I went back to back in April of 2011. I went back to my old church in Nixa, Missouri, and I gave a talk, like a 30-minute talk there about various things, including Los Angeles and movies in general. And this was, a small Southern church. And so I went up and said stuff that some of them probably didn't agree with. I mean, I'm sure some of them think that the R rating is the worst thing ever. But they let me say it, and afterwards, a surprising number of people came up and asked me about the film industry, but didn't ask questions like, is everyone just evil out there? They didn't ask that. They asked about, like, how does a film get... they showed an interest in the process of filmmaking. They weren't necessarily interested in analyzing things, but they wanted to go deeper into what film is in some capacity. And so I think if you'd asked me this 7 years ago, I would have said, like, yeah, Chicago, I knew a lot of people that love movies. Back in, small town Missouri, people just didn't care that much. But I found that the older I get, the more I realize that's a stupid point of view. There are plenty of people. I went to school with people who were in the film department, and as far as I can tell, couldn't have cared less about film. I mean, I knew somebody who got into film, who went to film school so that he could get into film so that he could make money. That's ridiculous. There are so many easier ways to make money, I have to assume. So it's a very unnuanced opinion for me to say, like, yeah, Chicago and Los Angeles, people love movies. Denver, Missouri, people didn't. Because in every culture there are people that love film and long to engage with art in general, and people who just cannot be bothered. And I'm still working on it, but I'm trying to get to a point where I don't look down on the people that can't be bothered. Because I've come to realize everybody's got their thing. Some people are really into sports, and I do not care at all. And some people might say that I'm an idiot or small-minded for thinking in those terms. And so I just need to approach everything from a slightly more nuanced point of view. But also, here's the thing, and I figure we are going to get to this eventually, so I'll just get us there. So I am a Christian, and I was raised in the Christian church. So in every place that I have lived, I've been part of a church. I've known a group of Christians, and of course, in the Christian world, there's suspicion of film, suspicion of art in general, but film very specifically, and so that also might throw off my understanding of, as you say, just movie going in general.
What's worse about film to them?
I think with literature, you're not seeing anything. Even if the most crude sexual act is described on the page, I mean, many still wouldn't like that, but it is still up to your imagination. TV, I mean, unless it's HBO and these days, FX and Showtime and an increasing number of cable stations, unless it's that, there are restrictions on television. You won't see nudity. You won't see, whatever. And then music, the most that will happen is, some harsh language. So, whereas film, it's in the theater. And even if there's an R rating, people, you never know if an employee has had a bad day and is going to let in anybody. And there's no quote unquote
had a bad day or is getting paid $7 an hour, and I'm not going to start anything if I'm getting paid that.
Who's to say? So there's really no, for lack of a better term, regulation. And if you go back into film history, you'll find that the Christian community is really big on regulating art. And it is an unfortunate thing. And so better to just completely ignore it. This is not my opinion, of course, obviously, but the attitude seems to be just completely ignore it. Don't see anything. And if you don't see anything, then you don't run the risk of seeing something you're not supposed to see, or hearing an opinion you're not supposed to hear. And so I of course, think that is a flawed perspective. And that's something that I've tried to address on my other show.
In your other show, of course, More Than One Lesson has the subtitle Movie Talk for the Discerning Christian, I believe. And there's a universe of meaning in that discerning, isn't there?
Yes, it is. There is. Because something, ever since I was a kid, I feel like I'm very fortunate to have had the parents that I have. Because I think that They were both very intelligent, and they both introduced me to some really great movies. And I remember even as a kid, my dad would say, "What was your favorite part?" And that's a very basic question, but, you know, I was a kid. But it gets you to think back on the movie and determine which part had the most meaning for you. And even if it was a crappy movie and you're just a kid and you like the part that had the most action, it still is thinking back and examining and not just letting it be in the past. My parents also talked about the idea of discernment, and this is not an unusual Christian concept, but this idea of looking at anything with a slightly critical eye to try to figure out, to try to discern what the truth is, or what the meaning is. And so, when it comes to film, especially in the Christian community, there are some who would merely say, "This film has harsh language, I'm not going to see it." That's it. But then there are some who say, "Yes, there's harsh language, but why? Is it because of the story? I mean, I'm watching a movie about criminals. Stands to reason they would probably swear. I'm watching a movie that takes place in World War II. These characters could die at any moment. They're under high stress. Yeah, they'll probably swear." You know, and just looking at context means that you're willing to ask why. Why does it have this content that I normally wouldn't like? And trying to cultivate that instinct of not just taking everything on faith. And I say that as somebody who does have faith, but recognizing that you don't just have to accept something, you can also think about it as well. And I think the deeper you think about it, the more, I don't know, I think the more valuable your faith in that thing is, and the more you think about it, the more riches you will find, whether it be in faith or art or whatever. So I think discernment is a trait that somebody should really try to work on, and it is not really an unheard of thing in the Christian church to say we need to be discerning, but that discernment doesn't necessarily need to stop at, is this wrong or right? It can apply to anything. And so, yes, this is movie talk for Christians for whom discernment is an important thing in their life.
Now, that concept that if you see a movie with swearing or with sex, that will find its way into you. It'll burrow into you forever, and you're helpless against it. So just avoid those. Give those the widest berth possible. I mean, it's a concept that is, on the one hand, kind of hard to understand why someone would think that, but also it gives art this almost superpower level strength, doesn't it? I mean, it's a point of view that doesn't make sense to a lot of people, but if you believe that a movie that has sex in it can permanently change you because you saw sex in a movie, that at least it makes art seem powerful. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, yes, art is very powerful. And there is biblical precedence. There's a biblical argument for only letting in good things, knowing full well that in life there's going to be plenty of bad things that you have no control over. And so when you do have control over something, why not let in something that is positive? You know, there's the verse that I'm going to paraphrase, you know, whatever is good and holy and pure, think on these things. I've paraphrased it, so if there's any Christians out there, I'm sorry that I butchered that. And so it says, think on these things. It doesn't say only seek out these things. There's nothing wrong with seeking those out, and you shouldn't seek out things that are inherently evil, but it says think on these things. And if you're thinking on these things or dwelling on these things, well, you can get something that's good and holy and pure from surprising sources. And with art, chances are, if it's, you know, somebody who's looking to do more than just, you know, make money, chances are they're trying to delve into a deeper truth that we can all relate to. And if you are a Christian, you believe that any truth is closer to God. And so if it is an actual truth, then it's something that is good and pure and holy. Now, the question then becomes, are you willing to wade through swearing or sex or whatever? And when it comes to certain things like, for example, sex in film or nudity, there are some people that struggle with that sort of thing. They might be more preoccupied than most. Certain images get into their head and will not go away. That is an entirely, I just saw the movie Shame, and I've seen the movie Autofocus, and I know about myself and various friends of mine. It's not an unheard of thing that there are some people that are for some reason more susceptible to this sort of thing than others. So I'm not necessarily against going into a film cautiously, but it involves knowing yourself, and not just saying we're all the same. You need to know how you are and how you respond to certain things. And once you acknowledge that, I don't think there's any shame in saying, you know what, that movie has a lot of these things. And for me personally, that will overwhelm me. But by all means, if it doesn't bother you, go ahead and see it. And I think therein lay the problem in the Christian world, by the way, is that too often people take their personal convictions and say that everybody should have these. I have gotten off track, and I don't remember the question.
Well, it brings up an important critical issue nonetheless, which is how to put it, the divide between the content of a movie and that movie's approach to the content, or that movie's attitude toward the content. I mean, one of the movies on Battleship Pretension that's come up a few times in terms of a film difficult to really come to a settled critical conclusion on. I guess they all are, but this one especially. David Fincher's Fight Club, a movie that I'm sure the Christian community was not thrilled about in many ways. But that movie, you've talked with David about it on the show, and I think last I heard you guys discuss it, the sticking point came down to Fight Club's attitude toward the mayhem-inducing characters, one in particular in the film, how it's got kind of a clear eye on all this, but it also seems to find it too cool. Like the movie seems to find it cool. Is that about Get It? What you guys think about that?
Well, I can't speak for David. I do think that some of it is that Tyler Durden, played by Brad Pitt, his whole thing is he is who we as men all wish we could be. He's a free spirit. He's in good shape. Women like him. He's good at having sex. He's not a slave to his job. Everything that like a modern man is frustrated by. And
I think he even has a monologue saying all the stuff about himself in the movie too.
Yes, pretty much. And all the things that men are insecure about, he is not. And he doesn't have to be, because he's good at all of it. And so in that sense, Tyler Durden needs to seem in control and cool and incredibly desirable. And when I say desirable, I mean, that thing like women want him and men want to be him. So that makes sense. But then I'd say 60%, 70% of the way into the film, our view of Tyler Durden needs to change, because we are taking our cues from the narrator, and the narrator starts to realize that Tyler Durden is a destructive force, not only in his life, but in the lives of the world. But Tyler remains cool. And Project Mayhem, which is what Fight Club turns into, it turns into this anarchic, one could say a terrorist organization. And I remember David put it a really good way, which is, the film seems to want us to condemn Project Mayhem, which, by the way, is the brainchild of Tyler Durden, but still wants us to like Tyler Durden. And it's like, well, you can't hate Nazis and still think Hitler's okay. Right. And so that's a really obvious comparison. I apologize. But it's a good way to illustrate the point. It's the kind of thing, I've not read the book, but I could feel like the device of Tyler Durden and our feelings toward him, I could see it working much better in a book as opposed to a movie, because in a movie, he's still played by good-looking Brad Pitt. And even though they do shave his head and they put him in more outlandish clothing, so there is a change in his appearance, he's just the way he looks and the way he acts is still the cool guy, the guy that we want to be. And I feel like what they could have done is they could have made him a bit more monstrous and fascist, and all the members of Project Mayhem become surprisingly monotone. And it would have been interesting if they had made Tyler Durden more monotone, so that we understand this is not a guy we want to be like. He is turning into this machine, this, mayhem machine, which, yeah. And so that's a film that it's all about setting the right tone and having the right attitude, and the message of the film getting lost if you get that wrong. Now, I realize that many people won't agree with me about that, but, I know a surprising number of kids. When I say kids, I guess I mean like people that are 17 or 18. I know a surprising number of them that have started fight clubs. Now, I don't think you're supposed to watch that movie and come away with that. Now, I'm not blaming the movie for the audience's reactions. It's not the film's fault, but I think if the film had done a better job of ending with the tone that it clearly was supposed to have, I think less people would be like, yeah, that Tyler Durden's got it worked out. Let's do that. And so I think yeah, I think I agree with its message, but its execution, I don't agree with its execution because it actually muddles the message that it's trying to get across.
And, you mentioned before, talking with people about films, talking with friends about films, talking with film geeks about films, or whomever, and gauging their reaction, seeing what they think about a movie, and using that as a way to learn more about them, about their character, about their personality. From a critical perspective, from your critical perspective, when you're looking straight at a movie, do you think about it more in terms of the movie itself having a character, having its own personality to be understood, or is a movie more a reflection of the sort of creative intelligence behind it? You're getting to know the creators and their perspective on it. I mean, does a movie take on its own personality, or is it, when you're thinking critically, a reflection of its creators?
I think that you can't help but consider what the creator is trying to do. So I feel like that's something to try to avoid. At least that's what I've tried to do. I said earlier that I think once the film is made, it no longer belongs to its creator. It belongs to us. And whatever he wanted to do, whatever he meant to do, that's beside the point. He might have succeeded, he might have failed, but it doesn't matter, because as time goes on, the director or the writer, they're going to die. The movie's going to live on, and any context that the creator might give us for what they were trying to do with the film, that'll go away. The only thing that will exist as time goes on is the film. And so I feel like you should try to look at it as not as objectively as possible, because you bring your own issues to it, but I've actually gotten to a point now where I no longer listen to like director commentaries, and I don't like to listen to directors talk about their own movies or about one movie in particular and what they tried to do with it, or even some of the difficulties they had in making it, because I feel like that gums up my own personal reaction to it. And so in that sense, I think trying to divorce the film from the intention of the filmmaker, I think that is a good thing, because the less you know about everything behind it, the more you are able to personally engage with it on your terms and on the terms of the film that exists, not the film that the filmmaker wishes exists. And so, yeah, I do think a film is its own thing once it is made.
But when you're watching the films of, say, an Orson Welles, it's hard to resist wanting to know Orson Welles, the man, is it not?
Oh, very much. Yeah, it's very difficult, and in fact, I've read several books about him. But what's interesting is I read various books by Simon Callow, which are he's written two about Orson Welles. There's going to be a third one, and those, by the way, are wonderful books. And then I read a book of interviews called This is Orson Welles, and it's him with Peter Bogdanovich. And in those, Bogdanovich asks Welles about this film and that film. And even though I love the way Orson Welles talks, I found that book to be frustrating, because I love Orson Welles. And if you if you watch his films, you will see certain visual motifs and certain themes be explored, and you can infer things about the man from those things. But that's finding out about the person purely on the basis of his films, which I think is perfectly acceptable. But when I read that book of interviews, again, he's fun to read, he's fun to listen to, but it's, I don't know, now it sort of clouds my judgment when I watch this movie or that movie. Whereas reading about him the way Simon Callow writes him, I think that's a bit more acceptable because his life is interesting, and I would like to know how, because there's various details like how he at 25 got to a point, just as far as opportunity, where he could make this film. But I feel like to a certain extent that's been something of a mistake for me, reading any of them. And I'm not saying don't do research, of course, but I'm saying that, like, I'm much more interested in hearing Scorsese talk about somebody else's film, or Tarantino talk about somebody else's film, than talking about their own. Because hearing artists talk about other artists is really exciting. But yeah, I think there's nothing wrong with speculating who the filmmaker is based purely on the film they are making, or the film they have made. And you'll notice certain, I think a great example of this is Roman Polanski. If you didn't know any of the details of his life, and there are a lot of interesting details to his life, but if you didn't know them, and you still watched his movies, you would say this is a man who has dealt with major paranoia, often feels alone in this world, and often feels persecuted. You can get all that purely from his films. That is something, whether it be Chinatown to Rosemary's Baby to, he did a version of Oliver Twist. And even, what is it? What's that film with Johnny Depp? Now I don't remember.
The Ninth Gate?
The Ninth Gate. I was going to say the Sixth Gate, but I was 3 off. The Ninth Gate, thank you. And that's
pretty good gate, too, though.
No, hey, you know what? I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying it's not the one I'm looking for. And so, in all of these films, you'll find that common thread of somebody who is alone, and even if they do think they have any friends, chances are they're going to be betrayed. And so there's paranoia, there's loneliness, there's persecution. So if you watched all of those, you could come away with a lot of Polanski's life, even if you don't know the specifics. And I think that's a perfectly okay thing to do.
Being a film critic here in Los Angeles, where, as you said, you're near the people working hard to make films, you're near the actors, the directors, the writers, you know these people or could know them. It then gives you a closer proximity to the artistic conversation, the artists talking about other artists, the critics talking about all of them. But then you have to control for the corrupting influence maybe of artists trying to over-explain their own stuff. It sounds like a double-edged sword, being in the thick of it right here. Is that about right, or?
It can be. I do remember having a friend who lived out here, and he and I went and saw Transformers, which of course I didn't like, but he liked it quite a bit. And I remember saying that movie's not very good, and he had the attitude that is not at all an unusual attitude, because he was an aspiring filmmaker. I think he has since moved away, but he said, he goes, to me it's just admirable that the film got made. Making a film is hard, and so I'm not going to stand in judgment of it. And this, by the way, is an attitude that I've run across from people that are filmmakers, that are aspiring filmmakers, or don't have that ambition at all. But this idea that a critic is not allowed their opinion because they've never made a film, or they've never tried to make a film, and they don't know how hard it is. And it's just like, I think that's a ridiculous attitude, because the audience hasn't made a film. The critic is much closer to the audience than the filmmaker ever will be, and yet both the critic and the artist tends to view the audience and the artist tend to look at the critic as if they're the enemy, when in fact they should, in theory, be the friends of both. Expecting, trying to speak for the audience, assuming that they expect the best, and then being a friend to the artists by trying to hold them accountable and pushing them to be their best and trying to be encouraging when they can. But yeah, when you get people who, you see the struggle that they go through to make this, to make this movie, and it can be, it does kind of ruin some objectivity because, I have friends who've made various films, and I know some of their limitations as they made it, and I go in and I'm sorry to say, maybe I'm not sorry to say, maybe this is a good thing, but either way, I do take that into consideration when I talk about the movie. But not totally. Like, if the film is a straight up failure, it's like, okay, it might have been a failure for this reason or that reason. So the fault may not be on the filmmaker, but that doesn't mean that the film is not itself a failure. But yeah, there's tremendous temptation to oversympathize. And again, like I said, it's important to recognize that these are just people, that they're not out solely to piss you off with their terrible movies or anything. They're just people trying to make a living. But at the same time, you need to recognize, you need to try and be objective and hold yourself back a little bit and recognize, well, this is not a good movie or this is a good movie. I'm sorry, again, not to think in terms of good and bad, but this either does live up to its potential or it doesn't.
I've been speaking in North Hollywood with film critic Tyler Smith, co-host of Battleship Pretension, movie talk from two guys who think they know more than you, and more than one lesson, movie talk for the discerning Christian. Tyler, thanks for taking the time again.
Thank you for having me, Colin. And good luck on your new show.
Oh, thank you. You can find more about Tyler's two shows at battleshippretension.com and morethanonelesson.com. And to keep up with all of the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on Notebook on Cities and Culture, visit colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to the people backing this season, including Aidan Nullman, Andy Cooney, Ben Bartley, Brian J. Dell, Doubt Us Artwork, Greg Bigelow, Greg Linster, Henry Coronan, Umberto Grant, James Faber, Jonathan McCalmont, Mark Larson, Matt Warren, Mia Muratori, Nicholas Croft, Paul Doyle, Ray McGuire, Rob Montz, Robert Foley, Roberto Medri, Samuel Hansen, Sean Dudley, Small Demons, Stephen Ingles, Steve Himmer, TSD, and Wayne Wright.